In June of 1949, what is arguably one of the most profound novels of the 20th century was published. It was written by a tall, somber-looking Englishman by the name of Eric Blair. And if that name isn't familiar to you, well, it's probably because he published it under his pen name, George Orwell. Now, Orwell wasn't looking to entertain his readers. Rather, he was trying to warn them. He was trying to warn them of the possibilities of what the future could potentially hold if things continued on in the direction that they were going. Now, Orwell's book would be translated into 65 languages and to date has sold over 30 million copies. And that book is 1984. This episode of History by the Book. Now, there are no spoilers in this video, but if you haven't read 1984, now would probably be a really good time to go and do that. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to a place where you can read it for free online in the comments below. Now, before we get into the actual book, you're probably wondering, well, why did somebody with a perfectly respectable and easily remembered name like Eric Blair change it to George Orwell? Well, Orwell's first book was Down and Out in Paris and London. And in the book, Orwell is an impoverished drifter. And there's some episodes in that book that Blair felt would embarrass his family. So he decided to write under a pen name. Now, he picked George because, well, that's a pretty traditional and proper English name. And it's also the name of the patron saint of England. And Orwell came from one of his favorite places to visit, the River Orwell. Now, if this channel is one of your favorite places to visit, please consider giving it a like and subscribing because you really help me out. Now, another question is the title. Why did Orwell pick 1984? Well, there's some speculation as to whatever story you want to listen to, and that is that Orwell, or maybe it was his American publisher, decided that because the book was written in 1948, they would just flip the last two numbers around and make it 1984. Now, I don't know how much weight that holds because Orwell was considering some other titles, including 1980 and 1982. And by the time he published the book, Orwell had stated, "I am inclined to call it 1984 or The Last Man in Europe." Now, Orwell's publisher thought that 1984 was a little bit more marketable, and it also might have been Orwell's nod to two books that he had admired. One was Jack London's The Iron Heel, and the other one was J.K. Chesterton's The Napoleon of Notting Hill. Both books have events that take place in 1984. Now, the book itself is a warning about the power that an unchecked government can accumulate and use against society. And 1984 was Orwell's response to that. Orwell was concerned about the totalitarian regimes that were taking place in Russia and Germany, and I don't need to go into the history of those for you to understand why Orwell was concerned. Orwell feared that the government would dictate the form of society rather than society dictating the form of government. Now, Orwell had probably been thinking about the book for a few years before he actually started writing it. And one of the inspirations may have been the Tehran Conference in 1943, where Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt got together. And Orwell was convinced that these leaders were planning to split the world between them. And indeed, in 1984, there are three superstates. There's Eurasia, East Asia, and where most of it takes place is Oceania. Orwell was also concerned with the way language could be manipulated and used to control thought through the use of propaganda. And indeed, that's a big theme that runs throughout the book. And one of those propaganda methods is newspeak. And in the novel, Orwell wrote that newspeak was used not so much to express meanings as to destroy them. And another popular method that the government was using was distraction. Oceania was constantly at war, but the adversaries kept changing. And so by keeping the paroles, who were basically you and I, distracted by the constant changing of the adversaries and keeping fluid history by changing facts to match those changes, they were using distraction to keep the people from realizing just how much power the government had over them. But perhaps Orwell's biggest fear was the loss of individual freedoms. In the novel, all the characters, including the protagonist, if you can call him that, Winston Smith, are constantly under surveillance, whether they're at work or even at home. In the opening of the novel, Winston Smith has to sit in a tiny small corner of his room where the camera can't see him, where Big Brother can't watch him do the revolutionary act of writing in a journal. And ironically, as Orwell was writing the book, at one point he actually was under surveillance by the British government because they believed he had socialist sympathies. Now, at this point, Orwell was a well-established writer. He had been a journalist and a book reviewer and an essayist, and he had also published Animal Farm. So Orwell already had some claim to fame. And ironically, it was kind of that claim to fame that was starting to wear on him. Because in 1945, his wife Eileen died during a routine surgery while she was under anesthesia. She suffered a cardiac arrest. Now, Orwell was grieving, but he was also under pressure from people wanting him to do lectures and write more articles and do some writing commissions, doing interviews. And Orwell really just didn't want any part of it. Now, his mental and his physical health were beginning to deteriorate. Now, in 1946, Orwell was offered the chance to stay at a house named Barnhill on the remote Scottish island of Jura. And Orwell, who was desperate to get away from everything, jumped at the chance. Now, Barnhill had beautiful views, but it didn't have electricity. And Orwell would use paraffin and peat to light and heat the house. And he stayed in touch with the outside world with a battery-operated radio. Now, if you can imagine, Orwell, who always had respiratory issues, was inhaling peat and paraffin, plus he was a terrible chain smoker. So you can imagine he wasn't doing his lungs any favors. But it wasn't until a boating accident in where Orwell and his son and a few others had gone out on the lake and were caught in a whirlpool that tipped the boat over and sent everyone, including Orwell, into the really cold, frigid water. Now, thankfully, everybody survived, but the episode really took another toll on Orwell's weakening respiratory system. And 2 months later, Orwell found himself in what he described as wretched health. And he knew that he should probably go see a doctor. But he decided to prioritize the writing of 1984 over his health. And this book almost killed him. Now, Orwell knew that he was dying when he wrote this book. Orwell had found some moments of peace and tranquility, but he had also found tuberculosis. Now, Orwell continued to work at a feverish pace because he was trying to get the book written by the deadline that his publisher had set. And despite his illness, he continued to just really work himself to the point of exhaustion. As a matter of fact, Orwell described the process as a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. Now, at the end of 1948, Orwell did finish the manuscript, and he sent it off to his publisher, Fred Warburg, who stated that 1984 was one of the most terrifying books I have ever read. Now, at the time of publication in 1949, Orwell was pretty far along in his tuberculosis. He was spitting up blood and he was very exhausted, and eventually he had to go into hospital. But he did live to see the acclaim that he got from everybody from the likes of Bertrand Russell to Winston Churchill, and even his mentor, Aldous Huxley, who had been his French teacher when George Orwell was at Eton. Now, Huxley had some ideas about the book. He praised Orwell and stated that it was a fine and profoundly important book. But he also stated that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. And this is Huxley's way of saying that, yeah, you wrote a great book, but I think mine was a little better. Sadly, Orwell's time would be short. In the wee hours of January 21st, 1950, George Orwell suffered a hemorrhage from a bursted artery, and he would die at the age of 46. Now, you know 1984 is a powerful book because it's one of the most banned books in history. As late as 2017, there was a high school that was still trying to get the book banned because of its social, political, and sexual context. Now, I don't know about you, but I think book banning is actually a form of, mind control or thought control. And if you are afraid that a 16-year-old reading a book is going to turn into a sexually deviant neo-fascist, maybe the book's not the problem. Now, in 1942, Orwell wrote an essay titled Looking Back on the Spanish Civil War. And in it, he asked the question, but is it perhaps childish or morbid to terrify oneself with visions of a totalitarian future? And Orwell would answer, before writing off the totalitarian world as a nightmare that can't come true, remember that in 1925, the world of today would have seemed a nightmare that couldn't come true. Now, with 2025 just around the corner, Orwell's words are pretty haunting, and there's something you shouldn't just write off and not consider. Because in a way, I think that Orwell was able to kind of have an in-depth analysis of what he saw from his own personal experiences, from fighting in the Spanish Civil War and from spending time in Paris and London as a impoverished drifter who nobody was going to really pay attention to. So Orwell was really able to kind of get into things and places that he wouldn't be able to do once he started to accumulate some fame. So what do you think? Do you think Orwell was being an alarmist? Or do you think that maybe he was onto something? Give me your comments below. I'd really like to know what your thoughts are on this. And I want to say thank you for watching. And I'll see you next time on History by the Book.